Everyone laughed when a poor farmer inherited an old dilapidated mill. But what his daughter found inside turned out to be a 100 million secret that changed their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. Boone Carter had never believed in luck, at least not the kind that came wrapped in paper and carried by the Morning Post. His life was made of sweat and calluses, of aching shoulders and fields that gave him just enough to keep his daughter clothed and the dog fed. That Tuesday morning, he sat at the kitchen table with the weight of unpaid debts crushing his chest, staring at the last crumpled bills in his hand, $17, all that remained of years of labor. Clarabelle, barely 16 but already with a steady gaze that reminded him so much of her late mother, sat across from him, spoon untouched in her bowl of porridge. Rusty, their old hound, sniffed eagerly at the strange yellowed envelope that had been pushed beneath their door. The envelope was thick, its paper brittle, and the handwriting on the front shaky but deliberate. The return address was a place Boone had never heard of, and the name Malachi Brooks meant nothing to him. Inside, a folded deed declared that he was the inheritor of a property far from their farm, a structure that county records dismissed as unproductive land, with a crumbling watermill at its heart. Alongside the deed in faded ink were words that stirred an unease he couldn't explain. You inherit my mill and everything on it. Look for what I couldn't take with me. The answer is where the wheel stands still. Boone frowned, running his thumb over the paper, as though the texture might give him answers. His mother had never spoken of a man named Malachi, and yet this stranger knew his full name, knew his farm's address, even knew enough to send a legal document that bound him to land he had never seen. Clarabelle leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching when she read the words. Why would someone leave you a mill, Papa? She whispered. Boone had no answer. Perhaps it was a cruel joke, perhaps a trap, or perhaps, against all reason, it was a gift. For 2 nights he argued with himself, staring at the bank notices that piled higher with each passing week. The farm he'd poured his life into was slipping away, and no prayer or sweat could stop its decline. On the 3rd morning, he hitched their wagon, loaded what little food they could spare, and told his daughter to pack a bag. They would see this mill, even if it turned out to be nothing more than rotting beams and river mud. At worst, it was wasted time. At best, it might hold something to help them. Rusty barked as if he approved of the plan, though Boone suspected the dog simply wanted the change of air. The journey was long and harsh, the road little more than a scar of dirt winding across the countryside. The sky threatened rain, and when it finally broke, the downpour turned dust into mire. The wagon wheels groaned and splashed through ruts that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Clarabelle shivered under a blanket, though she refused to complain, her eyes always scanning the horizon with quiet determination. Boone felt the sting of shame with every mile. A father should bring his daughter comfort, not drag her through storms toward a ruin. Yet a spark of stubborn hope burned low inside him, the same flame that had carried him through every season of hunger and disappointment. As the hours stretched, the world grew lonelier. The farms thinned, then disappeared altogether, replaced by wild fields and forests untouched by plow or axe. At night they camped by the roadside, the wagon their only shelter, and Boone lay awake listening to the rain hammering on the canvas, wondering if he was a fool. His dreams were restless, filled with the steady grinding of wheels and the rush of unseen water. He woke in the darkness to the sound of Rusty growling softly, but there was nothing beyond the tree line except shadows that dissolved with dawn. It was the 2nd evening when they finally reached the river valley. The air smelled of moss and wet stone, and the sound of water rushing over rocks grew louder with each bend in the road. The trees parted, and Boone reined in the horse as the shape of the mill rose before them. His first thought was that the building was dead, a corpse left to rot beside the river. Its roof sagged in the middle, its walls leaned drunkenly, and the great wheel that once harnessed the power of the water stood frozen, half sunk into mud, its paddles broken and blackened with rot. The river still roared beside it, but the wheel ignored the current, as though time itself had abandoned its turning. Clarabelle gasped, clutching his arm. "Papa, it looks haunted." Boone could not disagree. The mill's empty windows gaped like sockets where eyes had once been, and the creak of loose boards in the wind made it seem alive. whispering. The porch sagged under his weight when he dismounted, and the door groaned in protest as he pushed it open. Dust exploded into the air, choking them both. Inside, the gloom swallowed the light from their lantern, revealing only broken furniture, piles of discarded sacks, and cobwebs so thick they looked like curtains. Yet there was something else, too, a presence that prickled the hair on Boone's neck. The air smelled faintly of grain, though no flour had been ground here in decades. The great grinding stones loomed at the center, cracked but still massive, as though they had been waiting for someone. Rusty patted ahead, sniffing the ground, then stopped near the wall behind the stones and barked sharply. Boone followed, frowning when he tapped the planks and heard a hollow echo. Clarabelle crouched, running her fingers across the boards. "There's space behind here," she murmured, her eyes alight with curiosity. For a moment, Boone felt a shiver of something that was not dread, but recognition. He thought of the letter again, of the words about what could not be taken. He pressed his palm to the wall and felt the faint vibration of the river beyond, the eternal rush of water that no man could stop. The wheel stood still, but the river had never ceased. Perhaps the mill had not either. He turned back toward the doorway, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, yet some thread of determination tugging him onward. The farm was failing, the bank would come soon, and the world had given him little reason to trust in miracles. But here, in the shadow of the mill, he sensed that something more than wood and stone had been left to him. It was as if the building itself breathed, waiting for him to discover what it had guarded through decades of silence. Clarabelle leaned against him, her small frame shivering in the chill. "Papa," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the massive wheel through the broken window. "What do you think we'll find here?" Boone wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. He had no answer, but the words of Malachi Brooks lingered in his mind, words scratched by a dying hand and carried across miles. "Look for what I couldn't take with me. The answer is where the wheel stands still." As night closed around the river valley and the shadows stretched long across the ruined floor, Boone Carter felt the strange certainty that his life had shifted. The mill loomed over him, not just as a burden, but as a riddle written in timber and stone. He did not know yet what it meant, but he knew this much. Whatever secrets it held had been waiting, patiently, for him and no one else. The night in the valley was colder than Boone had expected. They had built a small fire on the porch of the mill, too wary to sleep inside the sagging structure where beams threatened to collapse at any moment. The river's constant murmur carried through the darkness, a restless sound that seemed louder with every passing hour, as though the water itself wanted to remind them it was still there, still moving, even when the wheel beside it had been silenced by time. Clarabelle lay curled beneath a blanket, Rusty pressed close to her for warmth, and Boone sat awake, staring into the flames, listening to the creak of the mill's old bones. His thoughts circled endlessly around the letter, the broken building, and the hollow echo behind the grinding stones. Sleep finally came, but it brought no peace. He dreamed of the wheel turning, impossibly slow, grinding not grain but the years themselves. Each rotation dropped coins instead of flour, golden discs spilling into the river until the current carried them away. Voices rose above the rush of water, indistinct at first, then sharper, calling his name, urging him to look closer, to dig deeper, to remember what had been forgotten. He saw faces half-formed in the mist, his mother's weary eyes, the shadow of a man who looked like himself but older, and a stranger's hand reaching out, holding a key. Boone jerked awake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the dream fading even as he tried to grasp it. The fire had died to embers, the sky was paling with dawn, and Rusty whined softly as if he too had been unsettled. Clarabelle stirred, blinking the sleep from her eyes, and immediately asked if they could go back inside the mill. Her determination made him hesitate. He wanted to shield her from disappointment, from the harsh truth that most likely the place contained nothing but dust and rot. Yet the dream clung to him, and the hollow sound behind the wall still echoed in his memory. He gave a reluctant nod, and together they pushed the door open again. Inside, the mill was even more oppressive in daylight. Sunlight struggled through broken panes, cutting narrow beams across the gloom, catching on motes of dust that drifted like ash. The grinding stones loomed as before, massive and cracked, their surfaces scarred from decades of use. Clarabelle moved carefully, running her fingers along the walls as though she were feeling for something hidden. Rusty patted around the base of the stones, tail wagging, then stopped again at the same place where he had barked the night before. He scratched at the planks and Boone knelt, pressing his ear against the wall. The hollow resonance was undeniable. He hesitated only a moment before prying at the boards with his pocket knife. The wood was brittle, soft with age, and splintered easily under his efforts. Behind it, in a narrow cavity, lay a small iron box. Boone pulled it out, coughing at the dust that billowed from the opening. His hands trembled as he set it on the floor. Clarabelle knelt beside him, her eyes wide with excitement. But when they opened the lid, disappointment washed over them both. The box was empty, save for a few scraps of paper rotted beyond recognition. Clarabelle's shoulders slumped, but Boone's attention caught on something else. Carved into the inside of the lid were faint etchings, a series of lines and symbols that looked like a crude map. He traced them with his fingertip, heart quickening. This was no ordinary box, no discarded relic. It was a clue. Beside the box, wedged deeper into the cavity, lay a leather-bound book. Boone pulled it free with care, brushing away dirt to reveal its cracked cover. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the ink had endured, dark and legible. It was a journal, written in a hand that was steady at first and grew more erratic with later entries. The name Malachi appeared on the first page, confirming the author's identity. Boone's pulse raced as he read the opening lines. "I have built this mill not just to grind grain, but to guard what cannot be spent. Time devours all things, but memory must endure. If blood finds these words, then blood must also find the rest." Clarabelle leaned close, her breath warm against his arm as he turned the pages. The entries spoke of solitude, of long years spent tending the mill while others abandoned the valley. They spoke of a collection, though the words were careful, never naming it outright. Malachi wrote of value preserved, of treasures hidden from greedy hands, of a legacy meant not for himself, but for those who came after. Between the paragraphs, small symbols dotted the margin shapes that matched the carvings on the box lid. Boone realized the journal was more than a diary. It was a guide. He closed it gently, the weight of it settling in his hands like a stone. Clarabelle's eyes sparkled with questions. But before he could answer, Rusty growled, low and steady. Boone froze, listening. From outside came the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel, then silence. He set the journal aside and moved to the doorway, peering out across the riverbank. Nothing stirred, but the sense of being watched prickled his skin. He stepped back, uneasy. Whoever Malachi had been hiding from, perhaps those enemies had not disappeared with him. Trying to steady himself, he returned to the grinding stones, running his hand along their worn surface. The mill was more than it seemed. The stones, the wheel, even the walls whispered of secrets concealed within. Malachi's words echoed in his mind. Time devours all things, but memory must endure. The collection, whatever it was, had been hidden with care, locked away not by chance but by design. The journal, the map, the symbols, they were only the beginning. Clarabelle picked up the empty iron box, her small hands turning it over, examining every detail. "Papa, what if this isn't the treasure, but the key to finding it?" she asked quietly. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from excitement, from the spark of discovery that lit her face. Boone studied her, struck by how much she resembled her mother in that moment, the same determination, the same refusal to accept despair. Perhaps this was why Malachi had left the mill to him, not as a burden, but as a test, a riddle that only family could solve. Outside, the river roared on, indifferent to their struggles, a steady reminder that time never stopped. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and secrets, and the mill seemed to lean closer around them, as though it too were listening. Boone held the journal against his chest and drew a long breath. The letter had brought them here. The dream had warned him. And now the first piece of the puzzle lay in his hands. Whatever else the mill contained, he knew with certainty they had only begun to uncover it. The morning light shifted, casting a thin beam through the broken roof to strike the grinding stones. Dust motes swirled in the golden shaft, sparkling like fragments of something far more precious. Clarabelle smiled faintly, her disappointment fading into wonder. Rusty wagged his tail, no longer growling, as if he too sensed the change. Boone set his jaw, his doubts hardening into resolve. The farm might be failing, the debts might be crushing, but here in this broken mill, a path had opened. Malachi's inheritance was no accident. It was a message across time, waiting for him alone to read. And beyond the journal, beyond the hollow walls and the empty box, Boone felt certain there was more. Much more. The journal weighed heavily in Boone's hands, not because of its size, but because of what it suggested. He had turned its fragile pages again and again, rereading Malachi's words until the faded ink blurred in his eyes. Time devours all things, but memory must endure. The phrase echoed like the river outside, repeating itself with a persistence he could not ignore. Clarabelle had fallen asleep against the wall of the mill that afternoon, her head resting on Rusty's side, the dog serving as both pillow and guard. Sunlight poured through the cracked roof, illuminating her face and softening the lines of exhaustion that were far too old for someone so young. Boone closed the journal at last, set it carefully inside the iron box, and covered it with a torn burlap sack. He had no intention of leaving such a thing exposed, not now that he had begun to sense what it might mean. When evening fell, he decided they needed supplies. The food they had carried from the farm would last only a few days, and he wanted to ask questions in the nearby village. So the next morning, he and Clarabelle loaded the wagon, leaving Rusty to watch the mill, and followed the rutted road downstream toward the cluster of houses they had glimpsed on their way in. The ride was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Clarabelle traced the carved symbols she remembered from the box with her finger on her knee, muttering them under her breath as though she might unlock their meaning through repetition. Boone kept his eyes on the road, uneasy. The dream from that first night still clung to him, and the hollow footsteps he thought he had heard outside the mill had not been forgotten. The village was small, no more than 24 buildings arranged along a single muddy street. Chickens scratched in the dust, children darted between porches, and the smell of smoke and baking bread carried on the damp air. At first, the townsfolk regarded them with mild curiosity, nodding politely as they passed. But when word spread that Boone was the man who had inherited the old mill, the looks changed. Whispers followed them. Some faces showed open amusement, others pity, as though they were watching a fool drag home a burden he didn't yet understand. Inside the general store, Boone purchased flour, salt, and a coil of rope. But the shopkeeper, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, leaned across the counter and asked casually how the mill was holding up. "Nothing but trouble, I'd reckon," he added with a grin that did not reach his eyes. Boone kept his answers short, unwilling to share more than he had to, but he left the store with the prickle of unease running down his back. Later, as they loaded their supplies, a stranger approached them. He was finely dressed for such a modest village, his coat clean and his boots polished. He introduced himself as Mr. Harper, a trader of land and property, and he expressed a keen interest in acquiring the mill. His words were smooth, his smile rehearsed, but there was something sharp in his gaze, a hunger that betrayed him. He spoke of how the land was worthless, how the river was untamable, and the building beyond repair. But he offered a sum of money far larger than anyone should have for a ruin. Clarabelle clutched Boone's arm, sensing what he did. The man knew something. Boone refused politely, guiding Clarabelle back onto the wagon. Harper's smile faltered, but he said nothing more. As they rode out of the village, Boone glanced back and saw the man still standing in the street, watching them with his hands clasped behind his back. That night, the unease grew sharper. They returned to the mill to find Rusty agitated, circling the porch with his ears flat. Inside, the burlap sack had been moved, and though the journal was still hidden, Boone felt certain someone had been there. The door showed fresh scratches where it had been forced. He checked the windows and found muddy prints on the sill. Whoever had come knew exactly where to look. Clarabelle asked if they should leave, but Boone shook his head. If they left, they would abandon whatever Malachi had meant them to find. The farm back home was already lost. Their only hope was here, in the mill and its secrets. Yet he could not deny the fear that crept into his heart. Someone else was searching, someone willing to break in while they were gone. The inheritance was no longer just a mystery. It was a prize, and prizes attracted predators. The following evening, as they prepared to sleep, Rusty's growl returned. This time Boone was ready. He snuffed the lantern and crouched near the doorway, gripping the handle of his knife. Clarabelle held the journal tight against her chest, her eyes wide in the darkness. From outside came the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on gravel. A lantern flared briefly, casting light against the broken windows, then disappeared. Voices murmured, too low to distinguish. The porch groaned under weight, and the door rattled against its hinges. Boone held his breath, every muscle tense. Whoever was outside tested the door, pushed once, then again, but the bolt he had secured held fast. After a long silence, the footsteps retreated. He waited, hard hammering, until even Rusty relaxed. But when he dared step outside with the knife in his hand, the night gave no answers. Only the river moved, shining faintly under the moon. Still in the mud near the porch, he found tracks. More than one set. Heavy boots. They had not imagined it. The next morning, Clarabelle's face was pale, but her eyes blazed with determination. "They'll come back," she said softly, and Boone knew she was right. He packed their supplies more carefully, shifted the journal into a deeper hiding place, and began to examine the mill with new eyes. Malachi had built it not only to grind grain, but to protect something far greater. If outsiders already suspected what lay hidden, then Boone would need to uncover it first. The river roared on, indifferent, but to Boone its voice had changed. It no longer sounded like background noise. It sounded like a warning. The wheel stood still, but danger was moving closer with every hour. The strangers by the river were not finished with them, and the mill had become a battleground they had no choice but to defend. Morning came gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over the valley, and Boone woke with the feeling that time itself was pressing down upon him. He had not slept well, his dreams filled again with the grinding of stones and the surge of water. Clarabelle had not slept either, though she pretended otherwise, her eyes shadowed as she moved about to stoke the small fire they had kindled. Rusty paced along the edge of the porch, ears pricked, every so often glancing toward the trees, as though expecting someone to step out of the shadows. The memory of the intruders lingered, a tension that clung to them as tightly as the damp in the air. Boone resolved they could not continue to wait for danger to arrive at their door. If the mill contained secrets, they had to uncover them before the strangers returned. He remembered the etchings in the journal and the symbols carved on the inside of the iron box. They seemed tied to the stones themselves, to the structure of the mill. Malachi had written that he had built the place to guard what could not be taken with him. Perhaps the mill's very bones were part of the riddle. Clarabelle insisted on helping, her determination steady despite her fear. Together they returned inside, where the grinding stones loomed at the heart of the room, silent and broken, yet still somehow formidable. Dust rose in clouds as they searched the walls, the floor, the beams above, knocking and pressing until their hands were raw from splinters. For hours they found nothing, only cobwebs and rot. But Boone would not quit. He remembered the hollow sound from the wall and the way Rusty had barked at certain boards. He remembered the faint lines drawn in the journal that suggested diagrams rather than words. He thought of the dream again, of the wheel turning, coins pouring into the river. At last, Clarabelle called to him softly. She had been studying the base of the grinding stones, tracing the grooves where once grain had fed into the mechanism. Her fingers had found a notch, so small it could easily have been overlooked. When she pressed against it, the stones shifted ever so slightly. Boone hurried to her side, and together they leaned with all their weight. There came a grinding groan, wood and iron resisting, but then yielding. And with a sudden jolt, the great wheel outside shuddered. Water splashed as though released from a hidden channel, and for the first time in decades, the wheel creaked forward a fraction of a turn. The entire mill seemed to tremble, dust cascading from the rafters, a deep rumble echoing beneath their feet. Rusty barked wildly, darting in circles. Then, with another groan, a section of wall slid aside, revealing a narrow passage lit by a faint draft of air that smelled of damp stone and age. Boone and Clarabelle exchanged a look of disbelief and awe. Malachi had not merely spoken in riddles. He had built them into the fabric of the mill, They stepped inside cautiously. The passage was cramped, forcing them to stoop, the air cool and thick with the scent of earth. Their lantern threw flickering light over rough-hewn walls that bore marks of tools, evidence that someone had carved this tunnel by hand. At the end lay a chamber scarcely larger than a closet, its shelves lined with decaying wooden boxes. Many had collapsed under the weight of years, their contents nothing more than dust and scraps of cloth. But in the far corner rested a heavy iron-bound chest. Boone knelt before it, brushing away the layers of dirt. Strange symbols were etched across its lid, the same shapes that appeared in the journal's margins. He tried the key they had found, but the lock did not match. The chest refused to yield, its weight immovable. Clarabelle ran her hand along the carvings, whispering them aloud as if reciting an incantation. Her voice echoed eerily in the chamber, and Boone felt a chill creep up his spine. Beside the chest, leaning against the wall, was a rolled map sealed in wax. He broke it open carefully and spread it on the ground. By the light of the lantern, they saw that it depicted the river valley and its surroundings, marked with symbols at several points along the banks. Some were circles, others squares, all drawn with deliberate precision. Each symbol matched those in the journal. The mill was only one location among many. Clarabelle's eyes shone as she traced the marks. "There are more," she whispered. Wonder and fear mingled in her voice. Boone nodded grimly. Malachi's collection, whatever it was, had been divided and hidden. The mill was not the treasure itself, but the key to finding the rest. They carried the map and the journal back into the main hall, leaving the chest behind for the moment. Boone could not shake the feeling that it was not meant to be moved, that its secrets would only reveal themselves when the time was right. Still, the discovery filled him with a strange exhilaration. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility lay before him, rather than only hardship. That night, as they studied the journal anew, the symbols began to make more sense. Malachi had written in riddles, but the map provided the context. Each symbol corresponded to a location along the river, places where the current was strong, where eddies formed, where old trees grew with roots like grasping hands. The collection had been scattered, hidden in vaults only those who understood the code could find. Yet even as they pieced the puzzle together, Boone's unease grew. The strangers in the village, the footsteps outside, the scratches on the door all pointed to others who were also seeking. If they already suspected the mill held value, what would happen when they learned of the map? Boone imagined Harper's sharp eyes widening at the thought of multiple sites of treasure, his polite words turning quickly to threats. The wind rose outside, rattling the boards, carrying with it the constant roar of the river. The mill's wheel turned another inch with a groan, water spilling from some hidden sluice that Malachi had engineered long ago. It was as though the building itself had awakened, called back to life by their discovery. Clarabelle clutched the journal to her chest, her expression both frightened and determined. "Papa," she said, "we have to protect it. We can't let them take it." Boone placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath her courage. He nodded. The inheritance was no longer a curiosity, it was a responsibility. The mill had given up its first secret, and with it had come both hope and danger. They had found the deep mechanisms Malachi had left behind, but in doing so, they had set others in motion as well. The wheel had begun to turn, and there was no stopping it now. The discovery of the hidden chamber should have filled Boone with nothing but triumph. Yet even as he and Clarabelle spread the map across the mill's worn floorboards and studied the strange marks, a shadow of dread lingered. The weight of the iron chest, the unyielding lock, the realization that the collection had been scattered across the valley, all of it was daunting. But what unsettled him more was the certainty that they were no longer alone in their search. Malachi's riddles were not secrets anymore. Others had guessed enough to come prowling at night. The echo of those footsteps beyond the porch returned to him again and again, a reminder that danger had already crossed their threshold. Clarabelle bent close to the map, her finger tracing the marks with careful precision. She was fascinated, her curiosity burning so brightly it outshone her fear. Her youth made her fearless, but Boone, hardened by years of struggle, knew what greed could do to men. Harper's smooth voice, the polite offer that was far too generous, had not been the end of it. He was certain the man would return, and when he did, his manner would not be so friendly. Boone's mind returned to the scratches on the door and the way Rusty had growled low and steady in the dark. Harper already suspected more than he should, and suspicion made men reckless. That night Boone barely closed his eyes, every creak of the mill pulling him upright, knife in hand. The river kept up its eternal roar, masking the smaller sounds until his nerves frayed, like rope rubbed too long against stone. Clarabelle slept fitfully beside the journal, her hand curled protectively over it, even in dreams. Boone admired her courage but hated the thought that she, still so young, had been pulled into a web of danger spun long before her birth. At dawn, Rusty's barking woke them. The sound was sharp, urgent, nothing like the playful noise he made when chasing rabbits. Boone rushed to the doorway and froze. 4 men stood at the edge of the clearing, their horses tied along the riverbank. At their head was Harper, his polished coat immaculate despite the muddy road, his smile just as wide as before, but stripped now of any pretense of civility. His eyes landed immediately on Boone, then slid past him into the darkness of the mill as though he could see through the walls. "Mr. Carter," Harper called pleasantly, though his tone carried an edge like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I trust you've had a chance to consider my offer. $50 for the old ruin is more than generous. You should take it while it stands." Boone tightened his grip on the doorframe, feeling Clarabelle come up beside him. She clutched the edge of his shirt, her other hand hidden behind her back where she still held the journal. He did not answer immediately, and Harper's smile tightened. One of his men spat into the mud, shifting the rifle slung across his shoulder in a way that was meant to remind them of the balance of power. "I told you before, I'm not selling," Boone said at last, his voice low but firm. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the damp morning air. Then Harper sighed theatrically and spread his hands. "I admire stubbornness, Mr. Carter, but stubbornness can be dangerous when it blinds a man to opportunity. That mill is worthless to you. To me it has potential. Why prolong your suffering?" His eyes flicked again to the journal hidden in Clarabelle's grip, and this time his smile was thin and humorless. Boone stepped in front of her, his body a shield. "You've had your answer. Now leave." The air shifted. The men behind Harper moved closer, their boots sucking at the mud, their expressions hard. They were not here to bargain. They had come to take. Rusty growled, his hackles raised, but Boone knew the dog was no match for rifles. The tension was like a drawn bowstring, each heartbeat an arrow waiting to fly. When Harper spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense. "You've found something. I can see it in your eyes. You think you can keep it, hide it, but men stronger than you have tried to guard secrets before. They always fail. Why risk your daughter's safety for a pile of stones and rust?" Boone's blood ran cold, but his face remained steady. He would not give Harper the satisfaction of seeing fear. Inside, though, he was calculating. He could not fight them here in the open. He had to rely on what Malachi had built, the hidden strength of the mill itself. He glanced back at the grinding stones, at the passage they had uncovered, at the chest and the map. Malachi had filled this place with traps of stone and water, puzzles meant to test blood and frighten off thieves. If Harper wanted to step inside, let him. "Go back to your town," Boone said, keeping his voice level. "There's nothing for you here." Harper studied him a long moment, then chuckled softly. "So be it. We'll let the place speak for itself." He gestured, and 2 of his men stepped forward, shouldering their rifles, approaching the doorway as if they owned it. Boone retreated into the mill, Clarabelle at his side. He whispered for her to hide the journal in the chamber they had discovered, to keep the map out of sight no matter what happened. She nodded, her face pale but resolute, and slipped toward the grinding stones while Boone remained near the door. The first intruder entered cautiously, the second close behind, their boots stirring the dust into ghostly swirls. The mill groaned under their weight, beams creaking, the old wheel outside protesting as water splashed harder through the hidden sluice. Harper himself remained just outside, his eyes glittering as he watched. Clarabelle's hand pressed the notch they had found earlier, and the stones shifted. A low rumble filled the air, the floor trembling beneath them. The intruders froze, startled, as one of the side walls creaked open a fraction before slamming shut again. Dust and grit rained from the ceiling. Rusty barked furiously, darting between them. The men raised their rifles in panic, but Boone shouted above the noise, his voice rough with both warning and defiance. "This place isn't yours to take." The tremor subsided, leaving silence broken only by the roar of the river outside. The intruders exchanged uneasy glances. Harper's smile had vanished. His face was grim now, his patience thinning. He stepped into the doorway, his polished boots sullied at last by the mill's filth. "You think this is a game of ghosts and tricks?" he sneered. "This place is nothing without the knowledge you hold. You can't keep it from me forever. You will open what Malachi left, and when you do, you'll wish you had accepted my kindness instead." Boone stood his ground, every nerve straining. He knew this confrontation was only the beginning. Harper and his men would not give up. They would return again and again, until they broke through or until Boone found a way to end it. He could feel Clarabelle's presence behind him, clutching the journal, her faith in him stronger than his own. He thought of the chest in the hidden chamber, of the map marked with scattered secrets, of Malachi's promise that time would grind down all but memory. The confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with Harper's cold smile as he turned back to his men. "We'll be watching," he said simply, his words more chilling than threats. Then they withdrew, their footsteps receding down the muddy path, their horses splashing into the shallows before disappearing into the trees. When they were gone, Clarabelle returned from the chamber, clutching the journal tightly. Her eyes were wide but burning with resolve. "Papa," she whispered, "they'll come back. We have to be ready." Boone looked at her, at the girl who had become his partner in this riddle of blood and time. He placed a hand on her shoulder, heavy with the weight of everything they had seen. "Then we'll be ready," he said, though in his heart he knew readiness might not be enough. The mill was no longer just a relic. It was a fortress, a labyrinth, a crucible left to them by Malachi. And now it was a battleground. The river roared on, as if mocking them, its voice filled with warning. The wheels stood still, but the world around them was in motion, drawing them inexorably toward the test that Malachi had prepared. The days that followed Harper's visit dragged on with a heaviness Boone had never known. Every sound beyond the clearing sent him to the doorway with his knife in hand. Every shift in the wind made him believe rifles were trained on them from the tree line. Clarabelle tried to be brave, keeping her hands busy with the journal and the map, but her eyes betrayed her worry whenever she thought he wasn't looking. Rusty no longer barked for attention or play. Instead, he prowled restlessly, ears pricked, his entire body taut as a bowstring. The mill itself seemed alive with the tension, its beams groaning louder at night, the grinding stones whispering with the drafts that crept through hidden cracks. Boone could almost believe Malachi's spirit was still inside, waiting for the right moment to rouse what he had built. They had little choice but to prepare. Boone and Clarabelle studied the journal late into the nights, the lantern casting shadows that danced along the warped floorboards. Malachi's words grew stranger the deeper they read, less like the scribblings of a lonely hermit and more like instructions written for those who would inherit his burden. There were references to water channels carved beneath the mill, to wheels within wheels, to the balance of weight and counterweight that kept more than flour moving in this place. Boone realized the mill had been engineered not just to grind grain, but to guard, to trap, to test. It was a machine of secrets as much as stone and timber. On the third night after Harper's intrusion, they heard horses again. This time the riders did not linger at the edge of the clearing. Lanterns bobbed through the trees, voices called out sharply, and within moments Harper and his men were upon them. There were more now, 6 at least, perhaps more in the dark beyond. Harper himself strode at the front, his fine coat catching the lantern light, his expression stripped of charm. He no longer bothered with pleasantries. He wanted what was inside the mill, and he was ready to take it. Boone barred the door, pressing his back against the warped wood as fists pounded from the other side. Clarabelle held the journal tight, her breath quick and shallow. Rusty growled, low and constant, his body braced as though ready to throw himself at the intruders. The pounding grew louder until the old door cracked and splinters flew. Boone felt the futility of his strength against their numbers, yet in that moment something deep within the mill stirred. The grinding stones gave a groan that was not caused by his weight or theirs. The wheel outside shuddered. Water, long diverted, surged into channels that Malachi had carved decades before. The men outside shouted in alarm as the ground beneath them trembled. A hidden sluice opened with a crash, and water roared beneath the floor, shaking the building. Boone staggered, clutching Clarabelle to steady her, while Harper cursed and drove his men forward. The door burst inward at last, and armed figures poured into the mill. Yet as their boots struck the floor, there was a deep grinding sound, and one of the side walls shifted suddenly. A section of boards collapsed into darkness, and the nearest intruder screamed as he vanished into the void, the roar of rushing water swallowing his voice. Panic erupted. The men tried to retreat, but the floor beneath them shook and buckled, ancient mechanisms responding to their weight. Stone counterweights groaned into motion, gears turned for the first time in years, and the grinding stones spun with a shriek. Dust and sparks filled the air, the sound of the river thundering through channels no one alive had ever seen. Clarabelle clung to her father, her wide eyes reflecting the lantern light as beams above them shifted and showered splinters. Harper shouted for his men to stand their ground, but his voice was ragged now, stripped of certainty. He stepped inside himself, and the wheel outside lurched fully into motion. Water cascaded over its paddles, spraying into the night. The whole mill seemed to awaken, every beam vibrating, every hidden channel roaring with power. It was as if Malachi had built the place to wait for this exact moment, to defend itself not with guns or walls, but with the relentless force of time and water. One of Harper's men tried to fire his rifle, but the floor beneath him gave way, and he plunged into the darkness below, his weapon clattering uselessly after him. Another stumbled as a beam swung down from the rafters, triggered by the shifting of the walls, knocking him unconscious before he could scream. Harper himself staggered as the stones ground louder, sparks flying from their cracked surfaces. He drew a pistol, his face twisted with fury, and aimed it at Boone. The shot rang out, deafening inside the mill. Boone felt the wind of the bullet graze his cheek and pulled Clarabelle down behind the grinding stones. Rusty lunged with a ferocious bark, his teeth snapping, and Harper stumbled back, firing wildly into the dust. The bullet struck one of the counterweights with a ringing clang, and the entire mechanism shifted. There was a thunderous crack as the gears locked and then released, and the grinding stones spun violently, belching clouds of dust into the air. Boone realized with sudden clarity that the mill was no longer safe. Whatever Malachi had built was tearing itself apart in its effort to defend them. He grabbed Clarabelle's arm, shouting above the roar for her to follow, and together they dashed toward the hidden passage behind the stones. Rusty darted ahead, barking frantically. Behind them, Harper cursed, his men screaming as the floorboards collapsed and water gushed up through the gaps, sweeping them off their feet. They plunged into the tunnel, the lantern swinging wildly, its light catching on the damp stone walls. The roar of the river grew louder as water filled the passageways beneath. Boone knew they had only moments before the mill's mechanisms consumed themselves entirely. Clarabelle clutched the journal to her chest, refusing to let it go even as the ground trembled beneath their boots. When at last they burst back into the main hall, the sight stopped them cold. The great wheel outside was spinning furiously now, flinging water into the night like silver rain. The roof had begun to sag, the beams splintering under the strain. Harper still stood amid the chaos, soaked to the skin, his pistol lost, his face pale with rage and disbelief. He locked eyes with Boone, and for a moment there was something almost pleading in his gaze, as though he realized too late that he had underestimated the force he had provoked. The floor beneath him cracked with a sickening sound. Harper shouted and lunged for the doorway, but the boards gave way and he tumbled into the blackness below, his cry lost to the roar of the river. The remaining intruders fled into the night, their courage shattered, leaving only their lanterns bobbing away into the trees. Boone pulled Clarabelle out onto the porch just as the mill gave a final groan. The wheel shuddered once more, then the entire structure collapsed inward, timbers crashing, gears shrieking, water exploding upward in a torrent that drowned the last of the sound. The mill that had guarded Malachi's secrets for decades was gone, consumed by the very power it had harnessed. They stood in the rain of spray, hearts pounding, staring at the ruin that steamed and hissed as the river reclaimed it. Rusty pressed against their legs, shivering but alive. Clarabelle turned her face up to Boone, her eyes wide and wet with both terror and wonder. "Papa," she whispered, "it's gone." Boone held her close, his own heart aching with the enormity of what had just happened. "Not gone," he murmured, pressing his cheek to her hair. "It's given us what we need." For in her arms, safe and dry despite everything, was the journal and the map. The wheel had turned at last. The judgment of time had been delivered. And though the mill itself lay in ruins, the path Malachi had set for them remained. The battle was not finished, but the inheritance had proved itself real, undeniable, and powerful enough to destroy any who sought to take it by force. The ruin of the mill still smoked in the dawn, steam curling upward from the wreckage where the river's waters hissed against splintered beams and shattered stone. Boone stood on the bank with Clarabelle pressed close beside him, the journal and map clutched protectively in her arms, and watched the water reclaim the valley. The wheel had stopped for the last time, half submerged and broken, its paddles torn away, its long vigil finally over. For hours neither of them spoke. They had survived, but survival carried a strange weight. The building that had hidden their inheritance was gone, and with it any sense of safety the mill's walls might once have offered. Rusty padded back and forth, sniffing the mud where Harper and his men had fallen, his ears twitching as though listening for sounds only he could hear. The dog finally came to sit at Boone's feet, resting his muzzle on the man's boot as if to say the danger had passed, but Boone's instincts told him otherwise. Harper's cry had been swallowed by the roar of water, but Boone could not be certain whether he was gone or merely swept away. Either way, the man's greed would not vanish so easily. Others like him would come, men who had heard whispers of Malachi's fortune. The battle for the mill was over, but the war for the inheritance had only begun. Clarabelle broke the silence first. Her voice was hushed but steady. "Papa, Malachi didn't just leave us treasure, he left us a choice." She opened the journal, its pages damp at the edges but still legible, and pointed to an entry she had read the night before. Boone leaned closer. The handwriting was uneven, but the words were clear. "The collection is not for hoarding. It is not for greed. It is for those who carry the blood to decide whether to let it die with them or to let it live in the world." Boone felt the truth of it settle in his bones. The mill had been built not only to hide wealth, but to test the heart of whoever inherited it. Harper had failed that test, destroyed by his own hunger. Boone and Clarabelle had been spared, not by chance, but because they had chosen to protect rather than plunder. The collection was theirs now, and with it came responsibility greater than any burden he had ever known. They spent the day drying the map by the fire and studying its markings in greater detail. Each symbol corresponded to a hidden place along the river valley and beyond. Hollow trees, caves, old wells, places only someone who knew the land could recognize. Boone traced the marks with his calloused finger, feeling the weight of every location. If Malachi's words were true, each one contained a piece of the collection: coins, documents, perhaps other journals. Together they formed something far larger than the iron chest in the hidden chamber. It was a fortune spread like seeds along the valley, waiting for the right hands to gather it. Clarabelle's face lit with cautious hope as she studied the map. "Papa, with even one of these caches, we could pay the debts. We could save the farm. We could start again." Boone's throat tightened. He had dreamed of such a moment for years, but now that it stood before him, it felt almost unreal. He thought of Sarah, his late wife, of her weary smile as she had tried to stretch their meager earnings, of her final words asking him to care for their daughter. He thought of the years he had spent scraping the earth for pennies, of the humiliation of borrowing against land that never yielded enough. Now suddenly there was more wealth within his grasp than he had ever dared imagine. But wealth alone was not what Malachi had left. Boone knew it as surely as he knew the rhythm of the seasons. The true inheritance was not gold or silver, but the knowledge of how to use it. If they spent it foolishly, it would destroy them as surely as it had destroyed Harper. If they guarded it selfishly, it would rot away like the empty boxes in the chamber. But if they used it wisely, if they allowed it to shape not only their future, but the future of those around them, then Malachi's legacy would endure. That night, Boone and Clarabelle spoke long by the fire. She was full of ideas, her youthful enthusiasm untempered by doubt. She spoke of rebuilding the farm, of buying land fertile enough to yield crops without constant struggle, of hiring back neighbors who had lost everything to banks and drought. She spoke of building a school, of giving children books instead of burdens, of creating a place where memory could truly endure. Boone listened, his heart swelling with pride at the wisdom already blossoming in her. He realized with a jolt that she had grown beyond the girl who clung to his sleeve. She was becoming the kind of woman who could carry a legacy far greater than coins. When dawn came again, they loaded the wagon with what little they still owned and turned their backs on the ruin of the mill. Boone paused once more to look at it, the broken beams jutting like bones, the wheel half sunk in the mud, the river sweeping relentlessly past. He felt no sorrow now. The mill had fulfilled its purpose. It had guarded Malachi's secret until the time was right, and then it had chosen its heirs. The past was ashes, but from those ashes, new life could rise. He climbed onto the wagon beside Clarabelle and flicked the reins. The horse moved forward, the wheels crunching through the mud, carrying them away from the valley. Their journey from the river was not easy. The road was rough, and danger still lingered in the corners of Boone's mind. He half expected Harper or another desperate man to rise from the shadows and strike again. But the days passed without incident, and soon the valley lay far behind them. The journal and map rode safely in Clarabelle's lap, guarded as fiercely as if they were holy scripture. Rusty trotted alongside, his tongue lolling, as though he too understood they were heading toward a new beginning. Weeks later, after following the map's guidance and carefully uncovering just a fraction of the hidden caches, Boone stood in disbelief at the wealth spread before him. Coins gleamed in the lantern light, gold and silver older than his father's lifetime, stamped with dates and images that spoke of history itself. There were papers too, certificates of authenticity, legal documents, receipts from auctions long past. Malachi had not been careless. He had prepared everything, ensuring that his heirs could bring the collection into the world without fear of thieves or governments stripping it away. Boone felt his knees weaken as he realized the truth. They were no longer poor. They were no longer bound to banks or drought. They were free. Clarabelle laughed, her voice bright with wonder, and hugged him fiercely. For the first time since Sarah's death, Boone laughed too, the sound bursting from him like a spring unsealed after years of drought. Yet as the months passed, he held to the choice they had made. They did not squander the inheritance. They invested it carefully, buying fertile land in a new territory, building a ranch that thrived with cattle, horses, and crops. They hired neighbors who had lost everything, gave them work and homes, and watched the valley come alive with life again. Clarabelle blossomed, her education expanding, her dreams reaching beyond what Boone had ever imagined. She spoke of teaching, of guiding others, of ensuring that Malachi's fortune served not just their family, but generations to come. On quiet evenings, Boone sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sun sink over fields that glowed golden with promise, and thought of the mill. He saw it not as a ruin, but as a monument to time, to memory, to the stubborn endurance of blood and love. The wheel had stood still for decades, guarding what mattered most, but in its silence it had been waiting for them. Now its burden had been passed on, and Boone had chosen not just survival, but legacy. Clarabelle would inherit not only wealth but wisdom, the understanding that true treasure was not in coins, but in the choices made with them. Rusty lay at Boone's feet, his muzzle graying with age, and the man who had once had only $17 to his name smiled into the twilight. Malachi had trusted him across time and silence, and Boone had proved worthy. The river of his life had changed course, carrying him and his daughter toward a horizon brighter than he had ever dared to believe in. And as the stars pricked through the darkening sky, Boone whispered a promise into the evening air, to Sarah, to Malachi, and to the generations yet to come. Their legacy would endure, not buried in the ground, but alive in the knowing, in the living, in the love that bound them to one another. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next incredible tale waiting for you. Click on one of the videos on your screen right now to dive into another adventure full of secrets and twists you never saw coming. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. Let them uncover the mystery with you.